Western Rome didn't fall in a day, but it did blink. And in that blink, it lost centuries of power faster than it could have imagined. With rising economic, social, and political instability, the question is the modern Western world doing the same? Before we can answer that question, let's first take a look at the main causes of Western Rome's downfall. By the 3rd century, Rome was the undisputed superpower of the known world, stretching from the wild moors of Britain to the deserts of Egypt, from the Atlantic coast of Hispania to the banks of the Euphrates. But the cracks were already spreading. Between 235 and 284, the period historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, the empire saw 26 emperors in just 49 years, almost all dying violently, either assassinated by their own guards or killed in civil wars. Men like Maximinus Thrax, murdered by mutinous troops in 238, Gallienus, struck down in a conspiracy in 268, and Aurelian, stabbed by his own secretary in 275. At that time, almost every emperor wore the crown, knowing it doubled as a death sentence. The treasury, once overflowing with spoils and tribute from conquest, was bleeding dry. Emperors debased the silver denarius, cutting its silver content from over 90% under Augustus to barely 5% by the mid-3rd century, fueling runaway inflation. Tax burdens crushed the poor, forcing many free farmers into debt bondage as colony tied to vast estates. In the cities, the signs of decay were impossible to miss. Forums stood half empty, roads fell into disrepair, and the once mighty aqueducts were neglected. The Great Plagues, the Antonine Plague in the 2nd century and the Plague of Cyprian between 249 and 262, wiped out as much as 1/3 of the population, hollowing Rome's manpower for both its legions and its farms. What had once been the heart of a thriving empire now pulsed weakly, choked by plague, corruption, and despair. The frontiers groaned under endless pressure. The Goths raided across the Danube, burning cities like Philippopolis in 250 CE. The Vandals pushed through Gaul toward Spain. And from the east, the terrifying horsemen of the Huns began their westward surge, driving other tribes before them. Desperate to hold the borders, the empire turned to the foederati. Barbarian federate troops settled inside imperial territory in exchange for military service. At times, these soldiers fought bravely for Rome. But loyalty was fragile. By the early 5th century, commanders like Alaric I, once a Roman ally, turned on the empire. The Roman Empire officially split into western and eastern halves in 395 CE, following the death of Emperor Theodosius I. This division was a result of the empire's vast size and the challenges of governing such a large territory, as well as the need to address internal and external pressures. In 410 CE, Alaric's Visigoths marched into Rome itself. For 3 days, they plundered the Eternal City. The first time in 800 years a foreign enemy had breached its walls. In 455, the Vandals, led by King Genseric, sailed up the Tiber and stripped the city bare in another devastating sack. Finally, in 476 CE, the Western Empire's last ruler, the boy emperor Romulus Augustulus, was quietly deposed by the Germanic general Odoacer on September 4th. There was no grand last stand, no epic final battle. The empire hadn't just been defeated, it had hollowed itself out from within. Its enemies merely walked through the open gates. One of the main reasons Western Rome unraveled wasn't just barbarian invasions. It was a ruling class that stopped serving the people. Emperors and senators hoarded wealth, fought each other for power, and passed policies that protected their own interests instead of Rome's future. Fast forward to today. Across the US and Europe, leaders often seem more focused on clinging to power and pleasing donors than listening to citizens. Policies that favor corporations and so-called elites while ignoring middle-class decline. Gridlock and partisan fighting while infrastructure crumbles and housing becomes unaffordable. Lobbyists shaping laws that ordinary people never asked for. In Rome's later years, emperors raised taxes, debased currency, and made reckless deals to appease elites, leaving ordinary Romans disillusioned. Today, critics argue the West sees a similar pattern. In the US, bailouts and tax loopholes protect billionaires, while millions can't afford rent or healthcare. And don't forget, the US national debt has surged past $37 trillion, reaching that sum years ahead of projections, with the government adding roughly $1 trillion every 5 months. And in 2024, over 770,000 Americans were homeless, up more than 18% from the previous year, driven by housing shortages and rising prices. A strong indication of a rising gap between the middle class and the rich. Housing, consumer goods, and service costs are spiraling, whilst public trust from citizens erodes and immigration issues intensify. And let's not forget, the rise of the BRICS coalition and its expanding membership, including new accessions from regions of Africa and the Middle East, has spearheaded efforts to reduce reliance on Western-led economic systems and the US dollar. The group now claims 40% of the world's population and approximately 40% of global GDP, surpassing the G7 in PPP terms. BRICS is not just an economic bloc. Its expansion represents a multipolar push against Western dominance, with moves toward alternative financial infrastructure. Rome in its final century was broke, bled dry by endless wars, corrupt tax collection, and a collapsing trade network. Its currency was so debased that it barely held value. Merchants would weigh coins to see if they contained any silver at all. The modern West, despite its political fractures and economic headaches, is still an unparalleled powerhouse by every global metric. Together, the US and EU account for 55% of the world's global wealth. Over 30 million millionaires call these nations home, with the US hosting 24 million of them alone. Their companies dominate the global scoreboard, with 2/3 of the world's stock market value tied to the US. The US bond market alone is worth $58 trillion, whilst the EU is worth over $20 trillion, representing over 50% of the global total. Financial pillars that investors depend on for stability. The US dollar, euro, and British pound hold over 80% of official foreign exchange reserves worldwide. The US dollar by itself is involved in 9 out of every 10 international trades and makes up nearly 60% of all central bank foreign reserves. Their dominance underpins global trade, central bank reserves, and investor confidence, adding significant weight to the argument that the modern West still holds immense financial power. When it comes to military influence, the US has over 750 bases in more than 80 countries, while the UK has about 145 military installations in other countries. NATO's combined forces maintain hundreds of overseas bases in the most advanced weapon systems ever built. Add technological dominance, from Silicon Valley's innovation pipeline to Europe's leadership in aerospace, pharmaceuticals, and advanced manufacturing. The West still sits at the heart of the world's economic, military, and digital infrastructure. While Rome's influence waned as new powers rose around it, the West still sits at the heart of the world's economic and security systems. In other words, the modern West has far more fuel left in the tank than Rome could have dreamed of in its dying days. Rome's fall wasn't inevitable, but it became unstoppable when its leaders ignored the warning signs. The West stands at its own crossroads, immense power on one side, rising vulnerabilities on the other. History doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. The question is, will the next chapter echo Rome's last, or will it write something entirely new? Share your thoughts in the comments.